Good morning and welcome to Russian Invasion, our special coverage of the war happening in Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale. The headlines. First batch of evacuated Nigerians from Ukraine arrive Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport, Abuja. Western countries condemn Russian attack on Zaporizhia nuclear plant in Ukraine. And United Nations says more than 1 million refugees are fleeing the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. A MAX Air flight carrying more than 450 Nigerian passengers, mostly students from Romania, has landed at the private jet terminal of the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in the nation's capital, Abuja. The passengers are said to be among those who fled into Romania from the Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion. Now, to provide us more details on this, we're being joined by our correspondent, Kayla Megwa, who is at the international airport in Abuja. Good morning, Kayla. It's been a long night for you.
Yes, it has. Good morning, Ladi. Yes, we were expecting this flight to reach Nigeria at about 3:30 a.m. So, Questmen, all of us, we were at the airport at about 2 a.m., hoping that by 3:30 this flight would come in. But that didn't happen until about 7 a.m. When we saw over 400 of the returnees coming in from this MAX Air flight at the private jet terminal of the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport.
Now, they are on ground there. They are going through formalities. Those who watched the earlier program, Sunrise, will know that you already provided that information. Could you give us more detail about what it is that they are expected to go through now that they are on ground? What do you know about that?
Well, it's a lot of documentation. We were told that a lot of them had to escape from Ukraine. So many of them didn't have passports, so special certificates were provided for a lot of them. So before they'll be allowed to go back home, which will be very soon, really, because the process is really fast, they're going to be filling an NITF and ECIF form, basically a lot of documentation about where they're coming from, where they're heading to, just to make sure that we have proper documentation of the Nigerians who have returned so far. They're also taking tests, PCR tests, COVID PCR tests, were ongoing at the airport as well. And then, of course, they've been advised to self-isolate until the results of those tests come out. For those who are negative, they can go on with their lives, but they're self-isolating, which means that they'll be isolating at home. For those whose tests come out positive, the report is that the FCT administration, the FCT health team, will be giving them free treatment for those whose COVID tests come out positive. So those are some of the documentation that's going on right now, and to ensure that we have proper records of who's in and where they're going to following this particular crisis.
Have you been able to speak to any of the returnees themselves?
Yes, we have. We spoke to quite a number of the returnees.
And what are they telling you about their experience? I mean, they're coming back to Nigeria from Romania, but I mean, many of them, in fact, all of them, were domiciled in Ukraine. So what did they tell you about their journey?
So, we tried to get a feel of how they handled the crisis when it started. A lot of them talked about how they were very scared. The sirens were constantly blaring. There were so many advisories as to, people should leave this area, leave that area. So for a few of the Nigerian students that we spoke to, they had to find some form of transportation to any border that was nearest to them. For these particular returnees, they were able to make their way to a border in Romania, and they got there. They weren't the only ones. We also have Ukrainians also fleeing the conflict. Arabs and, people from all over the world were at these borders, So the process to get there was really difficult. Someone told me he had to trek for hours. They were on their feet for 3 hours trying to get to that particular border. So quite a harrowing experience for a lot of these Nigerian students who have not experienced war, So it's very traumatizing. You can see it in their faces that they're actually really traumatized by the situation. by the time they got to the border, a lot of them talked about, the challenges that they had at the border. When they got there, one particular young lady told me she felt really bad when she got to the border and she saw the transportation for the Indian students and there was none for the Nigerians. She said initially it was really poor in the beginning. But when I told them to rate the Nigerian government's response afterwards, they said most of them gave it a 7 because they were talking about how by the time they were able to get into Romania, that the Nigerian embassy in Romania did a fantastic job housing them, making sure that they were okay. It said they were actually pretty shocked at how well the Nigerian embassy in Romania had treated them. They were very happy about that treatment. And they said that probably helped to reduce a lot of the stress that they had gone through. And, right now they're back in the country. They're really thankful. They actually took their time to be calling out the names of some Nigerian officials from the embassy in Romania and from the foreign ministry in Nigeria here who have been very helpful to them throughout this process. So very vocal young people, but also very tired. But, it was interesting to hear a lot of the experiences that they shared, but definitely some of them are worried about going back to school, for instance. One of the foreign officials, foreign ministry officials was speaking to us earlier, and he was talking about how the students who are in their final year, medical students in their final year, were not returned. They have to finish school before they can come back. They're trying to find some kind of way to make sure that they're safe throughout the period that they finish their education. But for the ones who have come back, he was talking about how arrangements are going to be made between the Nigerian government and the schools in Ukraine that the Nigerian students go to as to how they can continue the education online. And he was specific, saying we do not want that gap in their education. So those are some of the things that they're trying to work through right now.
I heard you say during your conversation with Malware on Sunrise just before this program started that even though there were huge words of praise for the embassy officials in Romania, it wasn't quite the same situation with the embassy in Kiev itself, and that many of the students had to find their way by themselves all the way to the borders, to the various borders. Did I get your reading correctly?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, one of the lawmakers, Mr. Adodogua, who came back with the students, was talking about how more funding has to go to our foreign missions. And when I heard him talk about that, I asked him what challenges he felt. He was talking about, the foreign missions have to be able to prepare for emergencies such as these ones. It's not only about people coming in and out of the country. Know that there has to be actual plans and budgets in place for situations like wars, for emergency situations. And when we took that from him, we decided to find out from the students, what their experiences were in the different embassies. And we did hear a few of the students talk about the embassy in Kiev, talking about how more needs to be done, how, at the time when they needed the help that they needed with the emergency, they didn't get that kind of help from the embassy in Kiev. We have a few students saying that to us, but they did have a lot of high praise for the embassy in Romania. So it's something that the conversation has started right now, and I think a lot is going to be done to look into our foreign missions and to see how they can be better prepared for emergencies.
Did you hear anything about what happens to the students after today, after they have been processed, as you have told us, through all the documentation? They've done the self-isolation, the results are out, and they're free. Is there any talk about looking after them or trying to ensure that those of them who have to probably go back or have any reason to have things brought back from there for them and so on? Is there any plan post today, post the arrival from the evacuation?
Well, nothing was said about that particular situation. What was said was that a lot of these people escaped. I think the focus of the Nigerian government, based on the communications that we got from them at the airport, is that they want to return as many Nigerians who want to come back. They want to be able to bring them back into the country first of all, before they start to look at, their properties and if they're going to go back and whatever other exigencies they might be. But the main focus really is to bring them back home, and that's where they are working on. A few more flights are going to be coming in. When it comes to some sort of assistance for the returnees. All we did hear the Ministry of Foreign Affairs state today is that they're going to give them some money. They're going to give them, I think, $100, he mentioned, for them to be able to travel, for those who don't stay in Abuja, so they can travel to their various destinations. And I actually remember the official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs stating that the least a ticket can be in Nigeria is about 50,000. So that basically helps you to start to get to your destination. So they're going to be given some money to get to their destination for those who do not stay in Abuja. But as for their properties or whatever it is that they've left in Ukraine, no word on that yet. The focus right now, according to the government officials, is bringing them back. And then things like their education will be looked into, and that will be something that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be looking into with the schools that these students go to. And I think it's part of the documentation that they're filling today. What school do you go to? How do we contact the school and things like that? So that's where we're at on that matter.
Let me thank you very much, Kayla McGuire, for your reporting this morning and the long night that you've had. We'll, of course, stay in touch with you throughout the day for updates on this story as well as your report. But for the time being, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Kayla McGuire reporting from the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja, where the first batch of 450 have arrived from Romania, where they were rescued from after fleeing Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities say the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is now secured after a fire broke out at a training building when the complex came under fire from Russian forces. However, the head of the regional state administration says that the safety of the power plant is, quote, secured, and he has been assured by the director of the nuclear power station in Enhardara that there isn't anything to worry about. In the early hours of Friday, a Russian attack on the nuclear plant caused one of the buildings at the plant, a 5-story training facility, to catch fire. The plant itself wasn't affected, but it was feared that the fire could spread if it wasn't quickly contained. In the meantime, Western leaders are accusing Russia of endangering the safety of an entire continent after its forces shelled the nuclear power station in southern Ukraine. Authorities say the facility is now safe and radiation levels are normal. The United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson said the, quote, reckless attack could directly threaten the safety of all of Europe. U.S. President Joe Biden urged Moscow to stop its military activities around the site, while Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the, quote, horrific attacks from Russia must cease immediately. All three leaders also spoke to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky by phone. Mr. Zelensky, meanwhile, accused Russia of resorting to nuclear terror and wanting to repeat the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. In the light of the recent attack just reported close to a nuclear power plant, Australian nuclear expert Maria Rubley says warfare near nuclear power plants is a, quote, recipe for disaster. Ms. Rubley, who is also the Monash University Associate Professor of International Relations, gave this assessment a short while ago.
Unfortunately, we could be quite close to a catastrophe when you have active military operations, including shelling, missiles, when you have active nuclear power plants. It's just a recipe for disaster. And all it takes is one missile that goes off, or like we see, some shelling that results in a fire. If the fire hadn't been contained at this power plant, it could have moved into the reactor area, and we could have seen a meltdown. So the risk is very high. People have been talking about, will Putin use nuclear weapons, sort of the deliberate use of nuclear weapons. That's not the real risk here. The real risk is having active warfare among these operating nuclear power plants. And the devastation, nuclear meltdown is going to release radiation that is not going to just affect the region, but it affects everybody, because nuclear radiation can't be contained by space. Obviously, the dosage will be less, elsewhere in the world, but it's something we all should be concerned about. The problem is that nuclear power plants need cooling. The reactors need to be cooled. And so if they're disconnected from the electricity grid, then we can have a nuclear meltdown. And so, accidental shelling, or if there's a missile, hit that hits either on purpose or by accident, then, we have, first of all, a direct hit to the reactor would mean direct and immediate release of radiation. But even if that didn't happen, if for some reason the connection to the electricity grid broke down and then the backup fuel, which is typically diesel, which is highly flammable, if that were to go, then suddenly we have nuclear power plants that are not being cooled. And that will result in a meltdown. And that's, for example, what happened at Chernobyl. Chernobyl was one reactor melting down. There are 6 in the power plant that we're talking about now. And so this would be worse than Chernobyl if that was what had happened.
There you have Maria Robley, Associate Professor of International Relations at Monash University. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, 1 million people have now fled Ukraine in just 1 week amidst the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. In a statement made on Thursday, Mr. Grandi said that he had rarely seen an exodus as rapid as this one in his nearly 40 years of working experience in refugee emergencies. He noted that more people are fleeing the country hour by hour, minute by minute, and that countless numbers of people have been displaced in Ukraine. Mr. Grandi also warns that millions more are likely to be forced to leave unless the parties can immediately end the conflict. Ratings agencies Fitch and Moody's have downgraded Russia by 6 notches to junk status, saying Western sanctions threw into doubt its ability to service debt and would weaken the economy. Russia's financial markets have been thrown into turmoil by sanctions imposed over its invasion of Ukraine, the biggest attack on a European state since World War II. The invasion has triggered a flurry of credit rating moves and dire warnings about the impact on Russia's economy. Well, Ini John McWa joins me as usual at this time to talk a little bit about this and about other business stories related to this invasion. Hi, Ini.
Good morning.
This downgrade, some would say was expected.
Yes, well, with all of the bashing that they're getting from a lot of countries and the world, the switch move and all that, apparently this is expected. And so the next thing now will be, what does this mean? How will it affect them? So, of course, your credit rating now, and it's a very terrible one, rating them down to like a junk status means that their ability or their credibility, you know, when you talk about credit ratings, you're talking about, okay, so you can go out there and have transactions, the trust that people can have in your system, you know, it's really down now, and this will really affect them. You know, yesterday we talked about the fact that a lot of Russians are trying to get out some money in dollars now.
That's right.
And then their currency has gone down. I think it's gone further. Yesterday it was it's still about 110 now to $1. And mind you, it was at almost at par before all of this
started.
So you can imagine going to 110 for just $1 now. So what this actually means is that the ability to clear trade payment is really, really downgraded at this time. And they have about 55% of their exports in dollars, 29 in euros. So you see that a lot of interaction is done in dollars. And so if the 1 ruble is going for 110, or 110 ruble is going for
just
$1
yeah.
now, you can imagine how much they have to pay for their debt servicing, for their exports. You know, it's really crashing the economy. These are some of the consequences of the sanction that they're feeling. And of course, talking about the ruble and predominantly, when you're talking about $200 billion, that's 25% of their deposit is in dollars. So this...
And that's frozen. That's part of this sanction.
Yes, it's frozen now. They cannot access it. And in fact, I think what they said is, I mean, the level of even their gold, because they do have some reserve in gold that's supposed to help protect their economy and everything, all that has been frozen, and their access to reserve has really gone down. So the sanctions are hitting hard, and it's hitting hard more on the Russians, you know, I know
than the Ukrainians, who are supposed to be the victims.
Exactly. So the Russians are the ones that are really feeling it at this time. Yesterday,
you and I spoke about global oil prices,
yes.
And they remain volatile, don't they? And 1 minute they're going one,
yes.
One way, and then maybe some information comes out and so on. What's the situation now?
Well, for this morning, it's, I don't know what to call this, stabilized, because it's still 110, but it's not as much as it was yesterday, even though earlier it got to 104 and then now went to 110 and all that. So it's just like you said, information comes and then it goes this way and then. But I think the biggest news in that space now is that the EU is looking at ways to boycott dependence on Russian gas and Russian oil. And even though sanctions have not, been put around that area, you have a lot of corporate, private controlled companies are cutting off transactions with Russia. So, of course, it's maybe putting a lack of a dumping status on their oil. So even though EU or European countries are still depending on their gas now, already EU is talking and looking at ways to cut off from the dependence, a huge dependence on that now. And that, so of course, reactions will follow that. Obviously. In a very short while.
Now, the IMF is, of course, supporting, and that's on the other side of the conflict. Now, the IMF is supporting
So we're not
Ukraine.
Just talking about Russia now.
That's right. The IMF is supporting Ukraine. How is that?
Yeah, they're getting a lot of support. The IMF has said that they will give them $5.2 billion, to help them in this situation. And that's apart from, of course, the arms from other countries. Germany, which is normally very, very silent. Right. They have already promised that they're going to give them some arms. That is a very different thing from what has been happening. And yesterday we talked about the cryptocurrency. Absolutely. Now, yesterday it was about $30 million. This morning they have about $54 million in Bitcoin. That's Ukraine.
That's a lot, and that's almost double what they had yesterday.
Yesterday, yes. So a lot of support coming on to them, and of course that is bringing a lot of green movements in the crypto market. But don't forget that Russia is also looking at that space too. Yes, because whatever is good for one is good for the other.
Absolutely.
So some people are saying, will they be able to escape the sanctions using the crypto space? But that conversation is still on. I'm not sure how they will do that. Yeah, because I'm not sure they saw it coming, or else they would have moved a lot of their assets and their deposits into crypto. But now it's not there. Most of what they have is in the dollar and euro.
Which is now under sanctions and which is frozen.
Exactly, yes.
Well, if you want more of this, if you want detailed analysis and all of that, John McWow will be on Business Incorporated at 1:30 in the afternoon. Right after this show, Laddie Williams will be on Business Morning, and all this analysis in more detail will be there. Ine, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
As always, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Good to have you too.
Now, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, 1 million people have now fled Ukraine in just 1 week amidst the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. In a statement made on Thursday, Mr. Grandi said he had rarely seen an exodus as rapid as this one in his nearly 40 years of working experience in refugee emergencies. Noting that more people are fleeing the country hour by hour, minute by minute, Mr. Grandi talks about millions more who are likely to be forced to move unless the parties can immediately end the conflict. In the meantime, a shipment of medical supplies provided by the World Health Organization, WHO, to Ukraine has arrived in Warsaw, Poland, and is expected to be delivered to the country to bolster its affected health care system. The first shipment includes 36 metric tons of supplies for trauma care and emergency surgery aimed at meeting the needs of 1,000 patients in addition to medicines for other diseases. However, the WHO urges them to establish a corridor to ensure humanitarian workers and supplies have safe and continuous access to reach people in need. Well, joining me to discuss this latest one and the role of human rights, as well as how this could all play out in a conflict of this magnitude, is Olatunji Lanre Barua, who joins us virtually. Good morning, Olatunji. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Of course, every time that you have conflicts, humanitarian crisis follows it. They're like Siamese twins. So this is not a surprise, but the lack of preparations, seeming lack of preparations on either side, did you see that coming?
I would say lack of preparation. I think on the Ukrainian side, because the president has been deliberately trying to play down the crisis, he didn't want the population to have a run-in, either for exit out of the country or a run-in on the banks, or to quicken a likelihood of economic collapse. That was why he was playing down the crisis. At the time, the U.S. government was saying, oh, the attack from Russia was imminent. Everybody kept wondering, why was he so confident that an attack is not coming? But I think he was just being diplomatic. He knew that the attack would come. But on the border side, I don't think there was lack of preparation, because I think the EU they had actually stepped up and moved in ahead of time. They anticipated there was going to be a surge. But the scale of the bombardment and the destruction is what I don't think they were expecting, that Russia was going to go on, without any scruples at all. But if you look at this, it's huge. The number of people who have crossed the border into Poland, in 2021 alone, Poland received only 5,000 refugees in 2021. And in the last 7 days, Poland has received more than 500,000 people. In the last 7 days, between late February and early March, 560,000 plus people have crossed into Poland. And that is huge for Poland. And, there are a lot of other issues that could come with that. But across the corridor right now, and one of the things I need people to understand is this class of refugees that are crossing, they are the middle class. They are the privileged ones. They are the people who are able to drive their cars to the border and maybe walk across. They are the people who have money, who can mobilize their resources, pack their families. The next wave of refugees are going to be the poor and downtrodden, the people who had little or no means to move. You are going to see, in fact, the scale of the tragedy will be more revealing at that time. But the first wave is usually the first class of people, the middle class, the business community, the people who have resources to move their family out. They are the first wave. And this is huge. When you have an average of 150,000 people moving every day. Now, look at the peak of the Syrian crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. This is tenfold the number at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis, the drift into Europe. These numbers we have had these 7 days is 10 times the number at the peak of the Syrian refugee crisis. So this is huge by all means. And Ukraine is a country with over 40 million people. We have only had 1 million plus about 1.2 million people moving across the border. Just imagine when you have up to 5 to 10 million people moving, it is going to be chaotic and it's going to be a real crisis. People are welcoming them right now, but there's going to be fatigue. There's going to be stress on the system in the host countries. There's going to be, the need for economic survival, the need for jobs. I know that certain countries are preparing humanitarian passports for these people. And the discussions at the UNHCR level and United Nations yesterday is to see how this wave of refugees, they can actually at least give them permit to work and live in those places without being bothered for at least 3 years. Which is good, is good, but because but it also has its own. It's ironic when you look at other refugee crises that we have had.
There is also the problem. You alluded to it very briefly in answering when you talked about the fact that there is going to be fatigue and a possible backlash when the numbers really get heavy.
Yeah.
If you're talking of a country of 44 million people, that's the population in Ukraine. And only 1 million or so have moved at the moment in 7 days. So if we're talking about, if this conflict goes on for another 7 days, another 2 weeks, another 3 weeks, and we keep the numbers moving at the current levels, there's going to be a political backlash because of the pressure on the systems in the various countries, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and all those others who have borders with Ukraine. Let me, of course, ask you about the humanitarian workers themselves, because they're also exposed in all of this. When they go into areas where there's conflict, very often the combatants don't really discriminate between them. And therefore, that also puts them at risk and makes the agencies that are critical to offering these services very reluctant to get involved if they're going to lose their staff.
No, absolutely not, and not the Russians, especially in the manner in which we have seen them executed this invasion. And if you remember, over the night there was the likelihood that the nuclear plants, one of the biggest nuclear plants in Europe, was going to be blown out yesterday, which would have caused a different level of catastrophe, in Europe at the moment. So if you look at the aggressors are the Russians, and the Russians they do not have any scruples about where and who they can attack. And for humanitarian workers, the risk is extremely high. But this is what we do. This is what people who have committed to humanitarianism have to do. Not that you have to just sacrifice your life on the platter, but most of the risks are measured. That's why we heard of negotiation between Ukraine and Russia about an humanitarian corridor. There will be certain routes that will be designated for, refugee passages and displaced people to be able to exit the country. And, there's been this debate about no-fly zone, for some time. I'm not sure that will come true, because if it comes true, I am very, very unsure that the Russians will comply. And I am also unsure that the US will want to deploy, its Air Force or NATO Air Force to enforce that. So it's going to be very complicated to enforce a no-fly zone so that people do not get bombed while trying to get out of Ukraine, and people do not get bombed while trying to help displaced people. So that is a double whammy, and it's going to be very difficult. But at the moment, it is really hot, and a lot of people are willing to help. Even Russians are willing to help the Ukrainians. And you find also similar attitude of compassion and empathy from the borders across from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania to Finland. Everybody is preparing. And what I foresee is that Hungary, Romania, and Poland might be a transitory hub for a lot of people that have been displaced, because you still have to come to the table and look at this crisis. You cannot allow the body to crush the European, Polish society. You are going to have to take a lot of people off them, move them to Germany, move them to other parts of Europe. And so in that way, you will reduce the likelihood of a speed towards a decline in empathy, of a speed towards a fatigue. Even we are not at the point where people will start talking about donor fatigue or empathy fatigue right now. This is still very fresh. It will take about 1 year before you get to that point. And we are going to get to the point where, a lot of resources will be coming from different nations across the world, and people will be sending relief materials. Nigeria will do that ultimately, because if you look at the statement we have issued, there's also going to be intervention from our hand. I foresee that coming. So we still have a long time before we get to the point. But the danger now is the military firepower of Russia, destroying the lives of more people and killing humanitarian workers.
Now, when you say that there's going to be intervention from this end, exactly how is that going to work? Because I happen to know that a lot of background work went into even the evacuation flights, which have now commenced to get the Nigerians that were caught up in the conflict out. So if you're now thinking of going in to help, I'm sure there will be more torturous deliberations and negotiations to ensure safety of both men and material. How is that going to work, do you think?
For a country like Nigeria, not necessarily sending personnel or, people down there on the ground. It will be more like, in terms of resources, the Nigerian government might decide to send, it will most likely be a commitment, a $5 million commitment, a $10 million commitment, probably to the UNHCR, to the refugee, different refugee bodies across the world. So most likely not in terms of personnel. Nigeria is too far removed from there, and we are particularly, not that empathy is common to all of us, and it is not transactional. But the resources we can give to a country like Ukraine will be in terms of our hard-earned resources, like just financial and some other things that we can push down to them. And I know that they will welcome them. Everybody welcome resources, any kind of intervention during times of conflict.
The World Health Organization, of course, is demanding a corridor, that a corridor be established so that those trying to flee can use that corridor, and then humanitarian workers can also use the same corridor to help them to move to safety and to treat those who have been injured and who have been hit by the collateral damage of the war itself to be treated. Now, given your own experience in this kind of thing, how easy is it going to be? I know you talked about a no-fly zone, for example, but that no-fly zone would be a military undertaking, whereas a humanitarian corridor, if I understand it, is simply an agreement between both parties that this particular area is okay for this particular purpose.
Yeah. It's always going to be complicated, honestly. It's always going to be complicated. Even at that, when you look at the manner in which the Russian aggression has been delivered on the people of Ukraine, you are wondering if they will be willing. But it was good news yesterday when we heard that part of the negotiation that the two countries had, was to create an humanitarian corridor. And the problem with humanitarian corridor is Russia might agree to 12 hours. Might agree to 24 hours. It will not be perpetual. So it will take the United Nations to enforce a perpetual, window for humanitarian supplies to go in and for people to be evacuated, to be treated outside of the country. Because right now, healthcare systems are broken down. They are overwhelmed. You cannot treat all the injured in Ukraine anymore. They have to be moved out. You can't treat all the children. People are being given birth to right now as we speak. And, you need to get the kids out of there. You need to get the elderly people out of there. And we will see. I think the United Nations has a capacity and capability to do that. But it will take a lot of negotiation with the Russians. And we will see. Also, the Russians, the way the war is going, the economic sanctions on Russia will also, there's an indirect, they will feel the heat in a way, and they will be willing to let go of some room for negotiation.
Well, if they do that, of course, there will be many beneficiaries. But before I let you go, Tuji, I want you to possibly gaze into a crystal ball, because no matter how it is, when this conflict is over and negotiations for peace take place under one banner or the other, rebuilding will have to take place, and possibly that's where the UN will play a primary role, because that will be like synthesizing. How does that traditionally work in the aftermath of conflict?
It's once there is cessation of hostilities on our side, it is easier. If you look at rebuilding and reconstruction going on in Nigeria in the northeast, it's been hampered by the Syria attacks by the Boko Haram sect and the different faction of the terrorist group. But once you declare peace and cessation of hostilities, you can allow third parties, everybody, to start rebuilding and to start reconstruction. And for Ukraine, it will be, the way I foresee it, there is a political angle to this. And I see down the line in the future, we are going to get to the point where people will start having conversation about how to convert some of the assets of the Russians that have been seized to be plowed into the reconstruction in Ukraine. That conversation will happen because everybody is looking at it right now. You have over $600 billion of Russian assets frozen across the world. I think about 17, under 20% are in USD, about 30-something% are in euro. So you have some substantial number in gold. So everything is being frozen in euro. And most of these assets will be offset to invest in the reconstruction of Ukraine. I see that coming. That conversation has not started. But if you listen to what Zelensky said yesterday, that Russia will pay for heavy destruction. Russia will pay for what they have destroyed in Ukraine. And that conversation is going to be the next phase of this. By the time hostilities end, we will now come to the table and say, well, Russia, this is a war you chose. You have to pay for some of these things. People are looking at it, but this is not the time for it. We need to end the war. We need to end, the bombings and, the killings of people, both the innocent and the soldiers from all sides. But right now, that conversation is still in the cooler, but I know it will come. And I see that actually coming because even Roman Abramovich, the Chelsea owner, who has put up his club for sale, has said that the expected revenue will go into rehabilitation or the support of victims of the war in Ukraine. And you are going to see people, I already see that coming. Most of the people who say Russian assets are being seized should also should be plowed into reconstruction. So we are going to have a fat bill for reconstruction. We will get to that.
All right, then. Thank you very, very much, Olatunji Lanre-Barua, for your thoughts this morning. Olatunji Lanre-Barua joined us virtually from Abuja, the nation's capital. We, of course, will be hoping to
Thank
see
you
you
for
again
having me.
sometime soon to talk more about this and the developments. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll be on the home stretch of the Russian invasion. Please stay on with us.
From the north to the south, east and west, Network Africa brings you news stories from all around the continent. With wide range in coverage, insights and analysis of special issues, we dissect Africa in its beauty and peculiarities. Network Africa tells the African story from the African perspective. Network Africa, weekdays at 4 p.m.
Religion acknowledges it. Science calls it fact. Man's survival depends on nature. Today's reality: war, pandemic, food scarcity, nature's way of fighting back. Join the Earthfile team every week on the journey to learn how to right the wrongs. At these times on Channels Television.
Thanks for staying tuned. The Russian Football Union says it will go to the Court of Arbitration for Sports to appeal against its ban from international competitions after the country's invasion of Ukraine. Russian football clubs and national teams have been suspended from all competitions until further notice by both FIFA and UEFA. The union said it would file one lawsuit against football's world and European governing bodies, demanding Russia's men's and women's national teams be allowed to compete. Russia wants its national teams reinstated to play their men's World Cup playoff matches next month, and the women's team once again included in this summer's Euro 2022 competition in England. The union also said it could ask for the suspension of competitions they were originally scheduled to compete in if unsuccessful. Former world chess champion and human rights activist Garry Kasparov has asked world powers to adopt a harsher military and economic strategy against Russian President Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine. In an interview with Reuters, Mr. Kasparov called on Western countries to recall their ambassadors from Moscow, eject Russia from the global police agency Interpol, and impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
Russia must be totally isolated. I'm still shocked that Western ambassadors are in Moscow. They have to be recalled, and all the contacts to Russian diplomatic missions must be reduced to absolute minimum. You're not breaking diplomatic ties, but you are demonstrating that Russia is isolated. Russia must be kicked from all international organizations, including Interpol. Financial blockade must be full. Now it's not full. There's still loopholes, and they must be closed immediately. Technologically, total ban. Russia should be thrown back into the Stone Age to make sure that oil and gas industry and any other sensitive industries that are vital for survival of Putin regime cannot function without Western technological support. So go after all the Western enablers of Putin and make sure they are forcing simple choice: renounce him or charged with crimes that Putin is committing now, and of course militarily. So Ukraine needs full support, and now clear skies are just paramount.
So we are going to do
International Paralympic Committee President Andrew Parsons has been explaining why the committee decided to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes outrightly from the Winter Games. The IPC initially ruled that they could compete as neutrals, but have since reversed their decision after facing heavy criticism and protests. Mr. Parsons describes the athletes affected as victims of their government's actions.
In taking our decision yesterday, we were looking at the long-term health and survival of the Paralympic movement. We were fiercely proud of the principles and values that have made the movement what it is today. However, what is clear is that the rapidly escalating situation has now put us in a unique an impossible position so close to the start of the games. Yesterday we said we will continue to listen, and that is what we are doing. Sorry. In the last 12 hours, an overwhelming number of members have been in touch with us and being very open, for which I am grateful. They have told us that if we do not reconsider our decision, it is now likely to have grave consequences for the Beijing 2022 Paralympic Winter Games. Multiple national Paralympic committees, some of which have been contacted by the governments, teams and athletes, are expressing their intention not to compete. Ensuring the safety and security of athletes is of paramount importance to us, and the situation in the athletes' village is escalated and has now become untenable. With this in mind, and in order to preserve the integrity of these games and the safety of all participants, we have decided to refuse the athlete entries from RPC and NPC Belarus.
Meanwhile, the arrival of Ukrainian athletes in Beijing for the Winter Paralympic Games has been called a miracle by a team official, with some narrowly escaping bombs as they left during the Russian invasion. Ukraine Paralympic Committee president says his team had been overwhelmed with solidarity since arriving in the Chinese capital, and that the athletes had been determined to compete.
It is really incredible that we managed to make it here to the Paralympic Games, because every single day we were faced with the choice and the question whether we will be able to bring the team together. Will we be able to bring everybody on this plane that will take off from Europe and bring us to Beijing? And this question remained open until the very end. I can be honest with you. The government of Ukraine is working in an emergency situation, and until now we didn't even manage to pay for the airfare for our team. And literally, while underway, we managed to find a solution to this problem. I want to say that we came here from Ukraine and we traveled through Ukraine. It took us many days. We had to overcome a lot of barriers that had to do with the war. Many members of our team barely managed to escape from the bombardment and shells exploding, but still we made it here.
UEFA President Alexander Seferin says he is personally helping footballers and officials stock in water in Ukraine, and that it is a 24/7 job to help them. Mr. Seferin revealed this while speaking during the Financial Times Business of Football Summit.
It's hard for me even to explain how tough, hard, and sad those conversations were. One of those players, when they successfully exited Ukraine, came to my home 2 days ago. The other one was here today. You have to know that I've got photos from their side when they were there with families, with children of 4 and 3 months, bombs exploding outside. I mean, this is bigger than football, and I'm proud of the football family, that football family stood together and we helped as much as we could. And we have many things like that are not public, but we have to work 24/7 to help to do our part. And our part is football part. So it's really hard to say what can happen tomorrow. We are all just hoping and praying that the war stops. This madness should stop as soon as possible.
It's a wrap on the morning edition of Russian Invasion. Thank you very much for watching. There'll be the evening broadcast at 5 p.m. Do join us for that. I'm Ladi Akeredolu. Do go out there and have a very good day.